Hello, and welcome to Lauren.live, the spirituality, health, and lifestyle podcast. Thanks for tuning in today. I want to send a quick reminder to subscribe to my YouTube channel. It always helps me to gain more visibility and get positive messaging out to as many people as possible. So I do thank you for doing that, liking the video, or sharing with someone if you enjoyed the content. You can head over to my Instagram page at RealLaurenLive, and of course my website, Lauren.live, for more podcasts and information about the content that I'm producing. Today's guest is very special and near and dear to my heart. This is actually my father, my dad, Mark Hale, and thanks for being here, Dad.
My distinct pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. So today we're going to be covering mental health, clinical psychology, psychotherapy, counseling, however you want to call it. My dad has been in the field for about 42 years plus, and I'm going to let him introduce himself, but he did graduate with a master's in social work, clinical psychology from Kansas University. That's where he got his master's, and he started out with group health, kind of in a more clinical setting, and then has paved his way into most of your career now has been in private practice. So we'll be talking a little bit about breaking out of the bounds of just the by-the-book medical system, the mental health aspect side of that, and also kind of how you've brought spirituality into your practice and how you've evolved personally, and then also how you've helped your patients evolve over the years. So we're going to touch on some of those aspects and other things that pop up. We'll just kind of organically converse, but I think more than ever with all the craziness going on in the world, it's a balancing act. There's so much going on personally and as a collective, and so I thought this was a really important topic to cover. I'll get some tips from you, observations from you, and we'll just kind of see where this goes. But I think it's definitely, mental health has always been important, but seems even more critical now with all the interesting things going on in the world. So with that, let's first just start, I guess, tell people kind of how you got into the field, what attracted you to it, some of your education, and then just where you started it up until now with your practice. Yeah.
Thank you. Initially started with an undergraduate degree in forensic studies. I had big aspirations of being a profiler in the FBI, and got a degree in forensic studies from Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, and took psychology courses and wanted to weave those two disciplines or professions together. And I had two mentors, two very astute professors who my senior year each individually took me aside and redirected me into the psychology track. They both gave me good advice and knew me pretty well and didn't think I would fit in the paramilitary sort of milieu of the FBI. And they were right. One of them said, "You're going to end up in Birmingham, Alabama," nothing against Bama, in a basement, filing charts or doing accounting for the first 5 years.
It's kind of like Mindhunter, that game, that if anyone's watched Mindhunter.
It's much like that, very much. Excellent production. So my senior year, I ended up taking about 12 psychology courses and ended up getting a double major. My first job actually was in inpatient psychiatry in a hospital in Indianapolis, a very strong classical medical model, mind-boggling experience with electroshock therapy and really severely disturbed mentally ill people and adolescents. And that piqued my interest in terms of staying in the profession. And one of my best friends also worked with me, who became a colleague of mine, and he led the way. He picked the University of Kansas. They had a very strong clinical program, a community mental health program. And so my friend Dan Myers, who lives in New York and taught for years at the Albert Einstein School of Medicine, went to KU, and I visited him and met some of the professors and faculty there, and then ended up getting a master's degree from the University of Kansas. Had a very good clinical internship both years there, and worked in outpatient mental health centers. And my first professional job postgraduate was at the University of Washington, also in inpatient psychiatry, which was a fascinating experience. It was a postgraduate experience extraordinaire with affiliation with the university and all the teaching levels there. So 2 years there, and then to group health, outpatient with a wide range, general practice, group therapy, couples, family therapy, individual adults, for about 10 years, and then moved into private practice in Bellevue. In private practice, I've had a general practice, although I've kind of tipped in the direction of specialty in couples, marital, and family. And more recently, in the last several years, about half my practice are individual adults with a myriad of different presenting problems: anxiety, depression, phobias, quite a bit of career issues, stress about career. More recently, I would say, as Lauren well stated, mental health and psychotherapy as a resource in our communities in light of this 1-year-long pandemic. I think colleagues would echo this. I don't think we've ever been busier. I think it's really been an aftermath of the pandemic and families being cooped up, working from home, kids doing school from home. Anxiety disorders have increased in adults, something like 37% new diagnosis over this last year. So it's really been a stressful period over these last several years for many people around the world, and certainly in our community in the United States. So we're staying busy in the profession.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, thanks for the intro, just a little background. And, I obviously know because you're my dad and we've had conversations, but, you have, I think, when I was younger, there was this I don't know what the right word is, but, you're seeing a therapist, and, it used to maybe be embarrassing, or it wasn't such a widely talked about topic. I think we've blown way past that many years ago, but I know many friends and family members that have gone to counseling, and it just seems like it's more popular than ever, and it's great that people feel comfortable doing that. And people, my therapist, it's like a thing now, right? But having a resource to talk to that's someone that's trained and not in your family, doesn't have a bias, I think it's really a great thing. And if you're watching this and you haven't gone to one, I highly recommend finding it. And it can take time to find the right fit. I know I went to someone years ago and I didn't quite feel like it was the right fit. But, before we dive into all this, if there is anyone watching that feels like they're struggling with something, do you have any words of wisdom to them, just how to kind of get into finding someone, or just encouragement, I guess?
I think in terms of finding a competent therapist, getting a referral from family members, not necessarily the exact same therapist that a brother or sister or a parent saw, but using family or friends as a reference point, not only for an individual, but also the experience itself. I agree with you. I think over the last several years, going to therapy has been destigmatized and, if anything, become somewhat fashionable or normal for people. It's really, I think it's really been a positive shift in our culture that you would go see an ear, nose, and throat person if you had sinus problems or earache or something. And I think if you have psychological problems, anxiety, depression, fears, relationship struggles, going to see a qualified therapist. And again, I think a big part of that is also if you had couples or marital problem, you would want to seek out a skilled, trained, competent marital therapist and try to do a good job of matching in that regard as well.
Maybe find someone who has a specialty. You're general, but if you have something issue with a child, it could be helpful to find maybe someone who's specializes.
Child psychologist.
Yeah. Okay.
Optimally.
That's good advice. Okay. So one thing I've talked about on this podcast many times is breaking out of the societal norm, if you will. there's plenty of good aspects to the way that our society functions, the rules, the guidance, the education. But I also think a lot of people are waking up to the fact that, there's other things, whether it's natural medicine, for your body or for your mind. There's different ways to approach things. Can you kind of speak to the beginning of your career and how it's shifted now? You were in a clinical setting. If you're local here in the Washington area, you're probably familiar with Group Health. That was a hospital, and they had the mental health department, and you were working under them, which did help you, take your career to the next level. But then you were looking for something with less structure and rules. You wanted to build your own practice, and you did move into your own private practice, and you've been doing that since. So can you kind of talk about how, what you recognized, why you moved out of that setting, and what you like about the private practice sector?
Yeah, I think that to succeed, to be skilled as a private practitioner, you need years of supervision and training and exposure to a range of other clinicians, again, optimally skilled, competent, highly educated clinicians. And so I think institutional settings don't always provide that, but can provide that. And as I mentioned, like the University of Washington had so many different visiting faculty, so many different levels of academic as well as clinical training, for any of the staff that would work there. In mental health centers, oftentimes some of the constraints would be like numbers, that you're required to see X number of people per week, or you can only practice certain types of psychotherapy. Also, many clinical settings may be operating on a medical model with psychiatrists in charge, and then there's a heavy infusion of psychotropic drugs, which can have their place, but I think are very much overprescribed in this country. Yeah. So one of the advantages of private practice for me has been opportunity to pick and choose the modalities that make sense to me, that feel like they're dynamic and helpful to my clients. And so probably 10 or so, 11 years ago, I took a training on mindfulness, and that really was a turning point in my career, my style of practice, where it motivated me to study Buddhism, attend more trainings. And so I've woven mindfulness, or many of the Buddhist psychology and philosophy principles, into my practice, whether it would be with individual adults, couples, families. So.
Consciousness, if you will. I mean, same thing, kind of individual consciousness, and then consciousness with whoever you're having an issue with, right? Kind of, we talk a lot about consciousness on this podcast, same thing as mindfulness.
Yes, I think of consciousness as multidimensional. A big part of it is self-awareness, and striving to be accountable and disciplined and wise and thoughtful, empathetic, compassionate to others. I think that those are some core tenets that could help people experience better mental health, and more fulfilling relationships, for sure.
Definitely. And for your own self, right? Self-improvement.
Well, for the sanity of the therapist. I mean, I think that's been a fringe benefit of studying the Buddhism and practicing meditation and mindfulness principles myself in my personal life, to help achieve the middle way, which I think is a very important Buddhist concept of being able to balance thoughts and emotions, our behavior, balance in a larger sense, relationships with family, with friends, our career, our physical health. That's been an area of my practice too that has intrigued me and motivated me to learn more about medicine and being able to contribute to our physical health via good mental health. That our country has something in the neighborhood of 45% of all adults. This is mind-blowing to me. And I've seen the number a couple of times now that are either hypertensive, obese, or diabetic, or all three of the above, and or struggling with heart disease. So I think to be a skilled clinician, we have to also be aware and mindful of a mind-body connection.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's all connected. When you were talking about the mindfulness, the word intuition came up, which is something that if you're spiritual, you're pretty in tune with. Our intuition, your pineal gland, that is the center of so much, and a lot of people don't think about it very often, but being conscious to your intuition, trying to figure out how to ask this, but I guess in yourself as the clinician, you're treating people or helping people. Talk about intuition when you're meeting people and helping with, whatever the issue might be, but also maybe some advice for people to trust their intuition. Have you had clients, tell you like, I kind of felt that, but I didn't listen to it, over the years, or I felt like I might do this, but then the ego got in the way, and then we have these continual fights, my husband and wife, or my partner and I, and I guess I'm just speak to intuition, I guess, in your practice personally for you, but also as you've observed hundreds and hundreds of, if not thousands of people in your career. Do you feel that we should be trusting our intuition more? Because I think it's easy to let the ego step in and you push that away, whether it be health-related, financial, career, relational.
That's a complex question.
I know.
It's a difficult question. I think, intuition is certainly a skill that clinicians or therapists could greatly benefit from in terms of working with clients and helping clients relieve their suffering. As far as clients are concerned, I could give countless examples of sort of aberrations of intuition, like multiple marriages and things. And I think one of them would be like ambivalence related to intuition. I have serious ambivalence about marrying this person, but I don't extend our courtship. Or
they didn't listen to themselves though, right? Where they kind of knew.
I went to the altar. I've heard this a number of times in both my practice and in my private life from people, that I went to the altar filled with ambivalence, and oftentimes those marriages don't last. They don't work out. Interesting. There was a great cartoon, one of the best psychotherapy cartoons. There's countless examples of it. It was in the New Yorker, and it was a couple having drinks. It was sort of a 50s kind of motif, but the wives were talking, and the wife said to her friend, I was filled with ambivalence, and Fred had numerous red flags, but I went ahead and married him anyway. And Fred was across the room having a drink with a friend of his, and he had greedy, selfish, unaware, drinker, liar, all over his suit. Yeah. So yeah, she might not have had intuition or followed her intuition. No? Right. So maybe that could be it, because I was thinking of like this is such a broad topic. Just to summarize, that's what we're trying to do today. Give some tips to people. Would you say that is one, is really in your personal life? It doesn't just have to be like within therapy or your problems, but just in life, because I know that you have a spiritual side too. Like tap into that inner intuition and listen to yourself. I think you have to believe in yourself, and you have to have self-respect, self-esteem. Optimally, I think it helps to have had success with practicing intuition and then being reinforced via the intuitive process. Yeah, well then that could start the cycle of it being more, yes. Exercise more, yeah. Okay, because I know personally, I feel a lot of people probably have had this experience, but in a relationship that was hard for me to get out of, but I knew it wasn't right, but I kept trying. And I think I've heard so many people say that, especially in relationships. It could be with a career or anything. It could be a relationship with your friend or your mother, but like
typically a romantic relationship. I've tried so hard, but so many years, we have so many history, like there's so many justifications, right? But I guess, like, what would you say to people that are struggling in a partnership, that have put in so much, but it seems like there's so much suffering. There's no growth. You know, it's one of those things where it's hard to just say, like, you either get divorced or you don't. I know you don't. A good therapist doesn't necessarily tell that. You're trying to have the person come to the awakening, right? You're just guiding them. But for people that have said that, or that are struggling in relationships, like, what is your advice? I mean, how much do you try, and how much do you your marriage vow before you give up? So, like, I don't know if you could speak to that, because I'm sure a lot of people specifically ask you that, like, how long do we keep trying, or when do we give up? Or I guess it's not the best way to say it, but you get my point. I think that's a struggle for a lot of people when they've invested so much. So maybe answer that, but also intertwine suffering, because I know there's a lot of people that suffer, but they want to stay in for, there's millions of reasons why someone could stay in a relationship. And it doesn't just have to be a partnership. It could be any relationship that has stress.
I think in terms of my own experience, I've had a number of clients over the years who come in with dreadful reports, a lot of suffering in their relationship with their partners, married or coupled. And it's a high wire act, I think, oftentimes for the therapist, that you want to advocate for the client to respect themselves and take better care of themselves and explore a range of considerations, perhaps points of considerations about their role in the relationship, what they've tried to resolve conflict or alleviate some of the suffering. Oftentimes partners resist or refuse to come in. You're right, it's not the therapist's job to recommend divorce or ending a relationship. If you push too hard, I think it takes the person's fear and jettisons them usually out of the therapy. It's also challenging in our community with the multicultural aspect of things. And so you have family norms and religion and sexism and so many different cultural aspects. In many cases, divorce isn't even an option, even if there's domestic violence, and something. So patience and empathy and compassion with those folks goes a long way. I think the goal, again, is to help them foster more self-respect and to believe in themselves that they're worthy of being treated respectfully, particularly if they espouse that with their partner. And divorce is an option. I mean, it's certainly not a first option, but it is a viable option after sustained efforts. I think one of the recommendations I make, this applies generally to therapy. I think psychotherapy is about change. And that's why people want a change in their lives, a change from inside, a change in their relationship, a change in their careers, whatever it might be, change with their kids, if there's family therapy involved and concerns about kids. And so the more willing people are, I think, to take risks and push through fear and apprehension, the more likely they will achieve their therapy goals. And so that dovetails, in my mind, back to if I'm in an abusive relationship. I recommend that people try different approaches with their spouse, and then I think that mirrors back volumes of information to them about what to expect. If you just keep getting rejected or abused or abandoned.
Like, recognize that.
Recognize after sometimes years of those dynamics in the relationship.
Sure.
Most likely, the atmospheric conditions aren't going to change.
Sure.
So this brings up, I think, an important part of psychotherapy and spirituality. I think that we all have our own fears, and fears can be paralyzing in terms of steps toward change. And I think it kind of boils down to either fear of abandonment or fear of annihilation, one or both of those.
Oh, that's a good point. I know there's so much to to cover within this topic. So my mind's just trying to figure out like, what do I ask next? Because we could talk about just that in one episode, but the words that stick out, and I'm not a professional, but from my own experience, from listening to you, from my own therapy work, from my own spiritual work, fear, insecurity, and ego seem to be some of potentially the top 3 triggering, aspects of our personalities that probably cause a lot of our own suffering and a lot of our own conflict. And some of it's detrimental. You could be very insecure, but you abuse others. And then you manipulate, and there's narcissism, there's all types of stuff. Or you're doing it to yourself. Someone comes to you and they have eating disorders, or there's fear, so they have to take control, and they do it in a certain way. So wouldn't you say some of the top things to look at, either within yourself or your partner, fear, insecurity, and ego, which could be narcissism or a bold personality that takes over? Are those some of the top 3 things that you think lead to a lot of people's issues and suffering?
I think that fear, in a general sense, is a prevailing kind of emotion that lends to anxiety and or depression. I think of anxiety and depression as more interrelated than a lot of clinicians do, as two separate, clinical entities. And I think sometimes anxiety could be maybe an activation, deviation from being depressed. I can't get up off the couch. I'm so depressed, I can't get off the couch. I can't leave the house, and then I get anxious about that, and maybe I can get up off the couch, but then I'm afraid to go outside the house, and so I revert back into depression. I think, again, the Buddhist philosophy, I think of Buddhism as a spirituality, a spiritual practice, a philosophy, a psychology, and a science. And it's been around since the either 6th or 5th, there's a lot of controversy about this, BC. And the Buddhist monks and the Buddhist scholars have been expanding on it. It's definitely not a cult. They usually avoid trying to convert anyone. They just put out a positive, loving, compassionate message to help people deal with their fears, to help people alleviate their personal, their relational suffering. And it just, there's so many principles and tenets to the Buddhist mentality, the Buddhist discipline, which lends itself, I think, very powerfully, very beautifully, symmetric to psychotherapy practice. Whether it's individuals, couples, even young kids.
Yeah, and you've studied it more than I have, but what I know and what I've kind of come to realize through you and some of the Buddhist techniques that I've read about and just spiritual practice in a nutshell really is, again, look within. Like, sure, there's exterior issues. If you're in an abusive relationship and someone else is hurting you, whatever the way that they're doing that, but still it's your choice most of the time, unless you're trapped, but it's your choice to stay. It's your choice to put up with it. It's your choice to leave. And so, or whatever the problem is that you're experiencing, it's within, and we have what we need within to get out. But we create a lot of our own suffering. And I know you've always vocalized that, and I always remember you saying that. So I guess, what are some ways for people to practice releasing themselves from the suffering? Is it just as simple as meditating and self-talk? And I mean, what are some ways to break out of those? I guess it's a way of thinking about things, right?
I believe our thoughts generate our emotions.
Yes.
And we move in the direction of our thoughts. And so if I'm greedy or angry or jealous or insecure, then I behave and relate and view the world in those ways. And I think our thoughts often create our suffering. Yeah. The iconic American author Mark Twain must have been an anxious man, because he had some pearls of wisdom around anxiety and fear. One of them was 90% of the things I worried about never came true. Yeah. And so I think this awareness of this continuous thought stream that plays in our mind, this internal dialogue, has so much to do with our mental health and how we feel about ourselves, how we relate to others, how we problem solve, how we see and perceive the world. It's like the Mississippi River, it never runs dry. And so if we can learn to observe our mind, not judge our mind, our thoughts, but observe our mind, sometimes get out of our mind if we can. And that's the pathway to that might be meditation, prayer for some people, sports, activities, pleasurable activities.
Sure. Being outside and gardening, doing something that's not relaxing or you find joy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think those examples are great examples of being in the moment. But I think we can learn ways to achieve being in the moment via this awareness of our mind, of what's happening in our mind.
And you can tap into that really anywhere at any time if you practice. It doesn't have to just be meditation or gardening or exercising. If you're in a stressful situation, you could literally become conscious and, okay, this is happening, but right here, right now, I'm okay. And just pause. Yeah.
Well, this, in my mind, is an example, and it's extra special for me to experience this with you. And whenever I'm around you, I feel joy and pride. But this moment is the most important moment in our life. And then there's a moment ahead, and there's memory and moments that we move through. But if we can become more aware and more immersed in the current moment. And of course, someone might counter and say, well, what if my current moment is suffering, depression, fear? That I think there are ways to move through that and learn ways to accept that it's inevitable that we will doubt ourselves or be fearful or anxious or disappointed. I think one of the most important things we could teach our kids is how to cope and deal with disappointment and move on, move into the next moment.
Sure. Yeah, that's good advice. And that's something that I've really changed my life. Eckhart Tolle, you're a big fan too, but The Power of Now, he's not the only one that speaks about this. Many people that are, conscious or enlightened or that are practicing that type of life talk about being in the moment, because it is truly all that is guaranteed. And I know that helps me. I've had some anxieties and fears over the years, and you've given me advice, and I've read about it. I'll just use an example. Flying has always been something that's been a little nerve-wracking for me, especially when it's turbulent. And you would always just tell me, like, it's passing. So even if you're suffering or you're upset or there's some issue happening right now, that's your reality right now. Be in it, sit in it. You don't have to fight it. It's okay that it's upsetting, but then it will pass. So whether it's a good moment or a bad moment, it will pass. So I think that's always been very helpful for me. So I think if someone is struggling to remember, this moment will pass, but also I think there's an importance, whatever the emotion is to sit in the moment and experience it. Because there are a lot of people too that might fight the fear or fight the emotion, but don't you think there is a beauty to experiencing some of the lower, if you will, points too?
Well, and that's an interesting thought about the lower point. One of the appealing concepts to me in Buddhism is that all emotions are on a horizontal continuum, as opposed to a Western psychology of joy and self-actualization and pride and civility and happiness are up here, and then envy and anger and hatred and racist thoughts are lower. And I think on this continuum, greed and joy and pride and happiness are right there with sadness, depression, perhaps even suicidal thinking on this continuum. That to me is one of the tragedies of suicidal attempts or completions is not recognizing that oftentimes just a day later the circumstances, it's not always as simple as that. I mean, suicidal people sometimes arrive at that place after
Sure.
years of uninterrupted loneliness and depression and despair. And there are certain cases where people can benefit from psychotropic intervention.
Sure. Where they can't get out on their own. Yeah. But thank you for acknowledging that, because I actually do agree with that. But, again, it's like, I don't want to say we've been trained, but in a way we have. You're sad or mad, you got to fix that problem and get out of it. But really, it's all just this constant, and there's highs and lows throughout every day. That doesn't mean it's bad or good. It's just part of a human experience. And I did a podcast episode about incarnating and being here on earth and having the ability and actually the joy of the experience of emotions, because it is said that in other planes we'll take the more happier one. There's just an, emotion of love. It's just a constant, but there's not the ability to experience the same sorrows that we have. And often, I think we can all agree, you grow the most actually after struggles and challenges. It doesn't even have to be a bad thing, but when you are challenged, you change or you grow. And so some of these words that we're using, it's not bad or good, it's just part of life experience. But I do think most people can agree, when you get out of that sad or tough moment, you really do grow and continue to evolve. So there's beauty within that. Yes. But finding silver linings and finding joy, even in hard situations, I think that's maybe really when you've started to master some of your own personal work and consciousness. So
I think it also helps to have a loving partner or family and friends, to that kind of support to help deal with difficult times in our life.
Yeah.
You mentioned one of my favorite concepts or experiences, love. And I think love is at the center of a happier life, a more contented life. You and Michael are demonstrating that with Valentina, Lauren's daughter, who is just an eternal fountain of love and joy. And I think if I have a couple of probably most enjoyable areas in my practice, it's working with parents and school-age kids and adolescents. And I think so much of human development, healthy human development, and kind of an absence of mental illness or addictions, is related to attachment theory of loving and nurturing, giving and receiving care and comfort to infant, 2 to 3-year-old, 5-year-old, up to adolescence, through adolescence. And I think most developmental psychologists would say that so many of societal ills, crime, racism, public health epidemic, have a lot to do with early childhood development.
Definitely.
And how kids were raised, or how kids were abused or abandoned, controlled, by their parents.
Yeah, and I mean, that it sounds cliche, right? Everyone talks about I went to the family of origin and I found out why I am the way I am, or but there's a lot of truth to that. And even just in our relationship, I look, and again, it's not bad or good. We naturally, you have some things that just come naturally when you're born. They say nature versus nurture, right? There's environmental factors. That's right. We're all human, so some of my qualities, bad or good, will pass on to Valentina, just like you and Mom did a great job, I think, with me. But, I have certain parts of my personality that I developed because of the way that you guys were. That's just natural. Sure. That's how it works. But yes, I think,
we were, pardon me, washing our hands way before the pandemic.
So I'm a slight germphobe, thanks to, no. But I think people can either take, in a more severe case with abuse or manipulation, you either carry that on, or if you're lucky enough to be conscious of it, you break that cycle, hopefully, before you have children. But yeah, I would say a lot of people's tendencies, challenges, or strengths, they come from your family of origin. And then it's up to you as an adult or young teen, you're starting to recognize things, to be conscious of whether you want to pass that on and continue that on, or if you want to break the cycle, right? But inevitably think of how influenced you are by your circumstances of your childhood. So yes, for those that have a little bit of a happier childhood, I think things can sometimes be, I don't want to say easier, but don't you think that's fair to say with your clients over the years, a lot of family stuff ends up coming up in the sessions when they're struggling with things?
Very much so, and family of origin theory and therapy is a big part of my practice as well. In my work with couples, so often couples who have long-term, seemingly unresolved, repetitive, hurtful patterns of, either attack or avoidance, and not speaking for days on end after a 2-minute argument. Often in exploring their families of origin, a part of the intractable, unresolvable, repetitive arguing is dated. I'm doing battle back here, hypothetically, with my domineering father or something, and acting it out in the marriage. Or one partner raised their voice slightly and it reminds the other partner of parents screaming and yelling at one another, so he or she shuts down and has to leave the room.
Right.
And so that awareness can be incredibly empowering.
Sure. So first comes the awareness, like, oh yeah, my dad was like that. And so it triggers. Trigger is a big word that's thrown around now, but rightfully so. Why is something triggering to you? Well, it could be family of origin. So then once you've observed or realized you're conscious to the trigger, then how do you break that? How do you heal? Like, sure, okay, my dad was a certain way and this is why I'm the way I am. Like, you've figured that out. That's step one. A lot of people could just get that far with therapy or by themselves. Then how do you heal that? Because that's years of exposure and it's hard to change. So what would the next step be? What's some advice that you give to people?
Well, I think it depends on the specific presenting problem and the nature of the psychological problem or suffering that the client, would be experiencing.
Okay.
So it would be hard to respond definitively to that. What I do know about child development is most of our core personality, our constitution, is pretty well established by age 8. So that birth to 8 are such important years, in terms of a person's, again, self-esteem and their sense of themselves, their susceptibility to peer pressure, things like that.
So what would be some things, I could probably answer for you because I do feel like you guys did a good job about this, but obviously a constant state of love. It doesn't mean there aren't moments that aren't perfect, but trying to have a constant loving relationship doesn't mean you don't mess up or raise your voice or have to apologize to your child or whatever, but you're human. But making sure they feel loved on a daily basis, presence, obviously being around and supportive. What are some other things you could tell to parents? Because we're all trying to do our best, right? It's hard work. We have our personal life while we're raising a human. So what are some things besides just love and presence that you could recommend?
Sure. Well, modeling is a valuable behavior. Modeling, a lot of parents yell and shame and criticize their teenagers, for example, when they get ultimately frustrated. And or the example I would think of is with spanking is when siblings get into a physical altercation and the parents say, "Don't hit your brother," and then they spank
not interesting.
Spank the child. So I think the goal is to try to help kids, again, believe in themselves, value themselves, respect themselves, and think for themselves. I want you to kind of shine and create your own light in life. And so, again, complex question of what are the factors and considerations. I think a healthy couple, in terms of the modeling, is a demonstration of what intimacy could be, what love operationalizing love versus talking about love, actually enacting love with respect, kindness, thoughtfulness.
And communication too. I know we always
Type of things.
we joke like maybe we over-talked, we over-analyzed, but overall it was a positive thing. I think and I want to do that with my daughter is open communication, because I think everyone hears that, right? Even with relationships, like you have to be able to communicate, because if you stop communicating, you're really doomed, which is kind of true. But having the ability to communicate with your own child, because I think a lot of people don't talk about things.
Talk less, listen more.
To the child?
No, well...
and to your partner?
With teenagers, they only hear, clinical research indicates they only hear the first two sentences that parents shift into a lecture mode or a stern mode. I think the other thing about parenting, just in a quick reference, is trying to help kids develop an internal locus of control, which translates to be, I'm not going to take a classmate's iPhone because my dad is going to ground me for 2 years. I'm not going to take my classmate's iPhone because it would hurt their feelings, it would cost them a lot of money, it would be inconvenient, it would be
inconsiderate.
Very inconsiderate of them.
That's a good way. That's a good point. So. Yeah. I know as I start my journey in parenthood, I really am trying to be conscious of what is my feeling, and then what are her feelings. And I think that's something that is harder said than done, and it takes practice. And I would like to practice it even more in my marriage. It could be in any relationship, friendship, or whatever. But again, that consciousness factor is so important in so many aspects. But really, in relationships, I think it can improve them. Not putting your fears and your insecurities on your child, and that's so hard to do. And I mean, it's going to happen here and there, but I think if there's some consciousness, at least it can help. Even if you're saying, I'm feeling this way, but you have a choice to do this or that. I don't know. Is that something that's...
Well, as your father, I would say there were a few times in your life growing up that it took Herculean self-discipline to not project my fears onto you, and try to be logical and rational, assessing, like when you were driving initially and they didn't have the state law, and so you could drive with friends, and when you went away to Europe to school and there were some bombings and things going on
it's hard to
Europe, and that you got to hold someone you love so much close and
not let them go out, but
suffocate them in the process. So I think that's ought to be challenging for us as parents. I think about it as sort of, as you well stated, not projecting, well, this is how my family did it. A lot of parents, particularly fathers, will say, well, I was spanked, I turned out all right, so there's 1.4 million alternatives to spanking a child in any and all circumstances. Spanking is scary, it's hurtful, it creates an intimidation complex and a lack of respect for the parent.
Yeah, I know. I was actually recently reading, if anyone has young children, I actually am following a really great page called Big Little Feelings on Instagram. You should check it out. But they talk about a lot of this stuff about validating the child's feelings so that they feel comfortable with expression. I think that's so important. And, realizing age-appropriate tantrums and all those things, they're learning how to deal with life. And so spanking and things like that, they actually talk about, statistics have showed that children that are spanked are more aggressive to their peers. So that's, again, a whole other topic. But since we brought it up, what would be some other alternatives? I don't know if you want to use the word discipline, but you guys never spanked me. What are some other ways that you can deal with a situation?
I think that's the word. It's discipline, guidance, mentorship versus punishment. See? So a 1-minute timeout in the chair for a 3-year-old who's terrorizing the family cat or something. 1 minute timeout could be accented with, and I love it because some spirited kids will put their body half off the chair. So that irritates some parents to no end. I say, they're testing limits.
Yeah.
It's a part of their human development.
Yep.
You want them to be a follower. But they stay in the chair, and what research indicates on this is the little coup de grace at the end would be, you did a good job of staying in the chair. Now you can go play again. 1 minute. 1 minute. So
Just
it's
to remove from the
teaching,
situation.
it's calming. It's potentially lending to self-comforting, some self-discipline, and then there's that little praise at the end. They don't get a trip to Disney World for sitting in the chair. It's just one little affirming compliment.
Sure.
Thank you for sitting in the chair. Now you can go back outside and play.
Yeah, I like that. Very good. Wow. Well, there's so many different parts. We've touched on just a few. But, before we close, what are some last takeaways that you've, discovered in your career, or that you could just express to people that are struggling? And, there's so many areas of life that people are working to improve or that feel they're stuck in. What are some, last words of wisdom and encouragement that you could give? Because, there's always been problems and there's always people that have been struggling and suffering, but right now is an interesting time to be alive, and there's a lot to sort through with media and social media and technology, and just very fast. So what are some tips you could give for people to kind of center themselves and sort through what's going on, I guess?
I didn't intentionally sidestep your earlier question about some of the tips. As I said, I think it's a complex question in relationship to the nature of the presenting challenge or difficulty. I would ask people to think about what for them is a definition of love, of happiness, of intimacy, and what they might be afraid of in terms of achieving those emotional states. And this matter of even reflecting on our childhood and family of origin, it is fascinating to me that two siblings from the same impoverished family in the depths of poverty and drug addiction and violence and crime, one sibling ends up a cardiologist at Tufts University, and the other siblings in prison for selling drugs. So we're talking a little bit about possible genetics, but let's say those siblings were in the exact same house, exact same family, 1 year apart. So I think about this Blue Zone study that the National Geographic sponsored some years ago, where they went around the world and they identified 5 different communities, Okinawa, Pasadena, California, which was one, Sardinia, a little community in Russia, with octogenarians and century-old people. And cross-sample, they were the same basic 5 factors. It was a positive sense of self, a good diet, exercise, a sense of purpose, and friendships and relationships with family and friends.
Yeah.
People that are married have a much longer, happily married, I should say, have longer life expectancy. Women who lose a spouse or divorce have a tendency to live quite a bit longer and have less depression, less addiction, less physical problems than men who live alone.
Yeah, those are good areas. Again, balance, right? Finding joy in many areas of life. Yeah.
So I didn't really answer your question about kind of advice for people. Seeking out a friend, could be as valuable as talking to a therapist. Sharing thoughts and feelings, putting voice to emotion, I think can be a pathway to feeling somewhat better. It's not a singular, technique.
It's a way to heal those, to actually get it out there And then, hopefully whoever you're telling, there's some support on that other side too.
Yes.
Yeah. Or maybe they share something with you and there's always some affirmation there. If you don't feel as alone. Sometimes a lot of people are struggling with similar things, Yes. We're all trying to figure it out.
Well, that's what I've learned from working with this multicultural population here from around the world, is that we're so much more alike than dissimilar.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. I mean, we only touched on a few little areas. There's so much to talk about, but maybe we'll have to do a part 2.
Okay, I would like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But thank you for being here, Dad, and sharing some of your wisdom.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Appreciate it. Helped a lot of people over the years, and thankful for the many people in the the psychology world for dedicating their career to helping others. It's really great to have people like you out there. So if you're struggling or thinking about looking for a counselor, highly recommend it. And we'll have to do a part 2. So if you liked this video, feel free to thumbs up it. Let me know. It helps me know what content you like, what's touched you. Feel free to leave comments. My Instagram @RealLaurenLive. Head over to my website Lauren.live. You'll see all the different platforms that you can find the podcast on. Again, YouTube. Here we've got the video going. So I appreciate your time listening to us today, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you.